Hello and welcome to this webinar, which presents new data from the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study. It examined the social, emotional, cognitive development of 5-year-olds of England, the United Kingdom, Estonia and the United States. During the webinar today, there will firstly be a presentation from Andreas Schleicher, Director for the OECD Directorate of Education and Skills. This will be followed by a question and answer session after the presentation. You may send any questions you have via the WebEx chat function, by email at edu.contact@oecd.org or via Twitter at OECD EduSkills. Just so that you know, the webinar will be recorded and the audio and presentation will be available from our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/user/educontact. I'd now like to hand you over to Andreas Schleicher.
Thank you. Today, the OECD is releasing the findings of what is the world's first international early learning and child well-being assessment. And it's one of the most exciting moments for us. It's a bit like 20 years ago when we launched PISA. Very few people know about the project at that point, but soon after it became the reference for quality in education. And the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study is an assessment too. But it's actually very different from the nature of PISA. PISA was about cognitive achievement, reading, math, and science. In this study, we focus on the well-being of 5-year-old children, their cognitive well-being, but also their social and emotional well-being. In the past, education systems didn't concern themselves a lot with children's early years, and if it was mainly around an agenda of childcare. Parents were working. Think about it. In school, we have a fairly clear idea about what children are learning because there's a curriculum and there are learning assessments. We ensure that teachers are qualified, they're well trained to do their job, and we pay all of that from the public purse. Well, in the early years, you can take actually none of that for granted. But it's worth to have second thoughts about that. Many longitudinal studies from a lot of countries which all find the same thing. That's children who have a great start in their early years, so before they start school, a lot better at school and in life than children who don't have such a chance. What I'm saying is that starting behind means staying behind. And these longitudinal studies also show us that it's actually a basket of early learning and well-being indicators that predicts children's later success in school and in adulthood. See some of them here on the screen, indicators such as children's oral language development, self-regulation, social and emotional well-being, all necessary for children's ongoing development and learning. And we also have new information from research on brain development, which helps us to better understand the findings from longitudinal studies. We now know there is a critical period of development, sort of up to around 7 years of age. After this point, children who haven't had a great start will struggle to catch up to their more advantaged peers, and most actually won't succeed in catching up. The early years of schooling can of course help, but after this point it becomes increasingly difficult and actually also more costly to help children into a more positive course. Now, actually, it's no surprise then that countries have paid more attention to children's early years. You can see here that participation rates in early childhood education have increased quite a bit, along with much higher levels of expenditure. Greater attention is being given to early years curricula and pedagogy, and more early childhood education have advanced qualifications than before, so more teachers getting to better degrees. Between 2005 and 2017, I take the average across OECD countries, enrollment of 3 to 5-year-olds in education rose from 76% to 86%. A bit more than 10 years and 10 percentage point increase in coverage. That's quite a dramatic change over a relatively short period. And 2 of the countries in the study, England and Estonia, have pretty much universal education by the time children are 3 years of age. The United States sort of lags behind. In 2017, the proportion of 3-year-olds in early childhood education and care was just 42%. But again, you can see actually how countries are moving to get more people covered in the early childhood education and care systems. But while putting children into early education and care centers is one thing, developing relevant learning and social and emotional outcomes is quite another challenge. So in 2015, there was a group of countries that came together here at the OECD to map out what a study on children's early learning and well-being would actually look like. And their interest was both on education outcomes, but also in those aspects of children's early development that help children grow up into happy, healthy adults who do well as adults, citizens. After lengthy discussions, the countries selected 4 areas of children's development that you can see here on the screen: emergent literacy, emergent numeracy, self-regulation, and also social emotional skills. From all of those, we have a lot of evidence that they feed into positive outcomes later at school and in life. And the countries also included a lot of contextual information relating to each child and his or her family, and also information on the child's participation in early childhood education and care, and information on the child's home learning environment, so that we can interpret child outcomes in their context and also provide parents, teachers, and system leaders some insights on what they can do about all of this. In other words, the study reflects a balance across children's cognitive and social and emotional development. I want to stress this because it is the very first time that an international comparative assessment had such a holistic and balanced focus around cognitive and social emotional well-being. And the study includes a total of 10 dimensions of children's early learning and well-being that you can see here on the screen. 5 on the left side on cognitive skills, and 5 on the right side focus on social emotional learning. Actually, there was no question among the countries that this balanced approach was the only way to make such a study meaningful. And I suspect we're going to see a shift towards such a more balanced approach and also children's studies at later ages. In fact, we're seeing this happening now already in PISA, where countries are opting to include aspects of students' social emotional skills in addition to reading, math, and science as well. Now, each of the domains for the early learning study was selected because longitudinal studies found each of them to be significantly predictive of children's outcomes later in school and also in adulthood. While there's some overlap across them, there's actually evidence that each of them plays an independent role. That's why we measured them separately. Of course, there are lots of other aspects of children's development that matter too. Visual motor skills, for example. But there's a lot of overlap between areas of early learning, so it's not necessary to measure everything to have an accurate measure of children's development and learning. So we picked a few things that we measured in greater detail to get a good holistic picture of child well-being. Now, the study is also really innovative in its approach to directly measuring skills. Children basically completed the assessment on tablets with one-to-one support from a trained study administrator. And the children then listened to stories. They engaged with cartoon-like characters in those stories by touching or moving items on the screen. And they were able to go at their own pace, for example, when moving to a new screen or to a new activity. The process was really very simple and intuitive, and we piloted it carefully with different groups of children before the study was implemented in the 3 countries. And children basically did not need any prior experience with tablets or any other digital devices to be successful on this assessment. Very innovative, play-based approach requiring no prerequisite, and actually children were highly motivated to do this. So, as I said, 3 countries where they had was putting this into the field: England, Estonia, and the United States. The OECD countries with relatively well-developed education systems. In fact, Estonia is one of the best performing countries in PISA, the top performer in the OECD. The United States was among the first countries that actually started PISA 20 years ago. And the US was also a very strong champion in initiating this study on child well-being. And the UK also is putting a priority on using data and other evidence to improve education outcomes for students, as well as increasing focus on children's early years. We've seen that before in the increase in coverage in early childhood education and care in the UK. So that's included efforts to increase access to early childhood education and care, and also for disadvantaged children from the age of 2 in the UK. And actually, some of the children in this study will have directly benefited from those kinds of measures. But there are also important differences across the 3 countries, such as the size and wealth of each country. And there are also differences in the level of support of families and children. As I mentioned earlier, you can see here, children in the United States are less likely to attend early childhood education and are more likely to live in poverty than children in the other 2 countries. Children in Estonia are more likely to have a mother with a bachelor's degree than children in either England or the United States. And you're going to see later that's a big advantage. As I said, part of the reason for Estonia's success is also in high equity among students from different socioeconomic groups. On this chart, on the vertical axis, you see the reading performance of children at age 15. So that's from the PISA study. On the horizontal axis, you see the strings of the relationship between social background and learning outcomes. And you really want to be in the upper right quadrant of this chart, where learning outcomes are very strong and the impact of social background on learning outcomes is minimal, so that all children succeed. And as you can see, Estonia is right in that quadrant. It's also interesting that Estonia hasn't always been there. It's actually reached its current position by steady improvements over successive PISA cycles. And it's sort of a system that is capable to learn and adapt when the time changes. Even when Estonia struggled with a difficult, financial situation in 2009, when it struggled through a kind of, declining youth demography, always been ready to respond and adapt. And its openness to learn about how 5-year-olds are really faring is also an indication how receptive Estonia is to new developments, new information. And systems that can orient their priorities from an institutional lens to children's actual needs will always have greater success overall and will always be able to achieve better equity and opportunity. What I also want to say is that the data is highly robust and comparable. The study is based on data from just under 7,000 children, based on representative samples from the 3 countries, England, Estonia, and the United States. And it also includes information on the child from parents and the teacher who knew the child best. And in fact, that was one of the most inspiring aspects from this study, that we had such great collaboration with teachers. Over 9 out of 10 teachers actually, that were asked to participate in the study, that were selected to the samples, basically agreed to participate, completed the questionnaire. Sort of a lot of enthusiasm from child educators that for the first time there was a study listening to their voice and including that in analyzing outcomes on child well-being. So very robust data, highly comparable data across countries. Now, let's talk about results. The first thing you can see is the gender differences in learning outcomes. They're already visible among 5-year-olds, our youngest. They're used to seeing gender differences later in school, but actually we can see some of that already early on. Girls had stronger emergent literacy and higher levels of social emotional skills than boys in each of the 3 countries. Girls were also better able to identify others' emotions. And what parents and teachers said in the study identified girls also as having higher pro-social skills and to be less disruptive than boys. The direct test found no discernible differences between girls and boys in emergent numeracy. On the test, girls and boys did similarly. But girls were reported by their parents and also by their teachers as having higher levels of emergent numeracy than boys. There's clearly a gap between what the data show us from what the children can do, very similar, whereas parents and teachers had this impression that girls were better than boys. And when you look at older age groups, we also see stronger literacy among girls in comparison with boys. Now, PISA makes it very clear. But at age 15, we also see that boys are stronger in mathematics than girls. And that's not what we can see at age 5. We don't know yet whether this cohort of girls is going to be different from older children for which we have data from PISA, or if gender differences in mathematics actually develop during schooling. That's one of the many things the study is going to be able to answer for us in a few years' time, when this cohort of children that we covered in this study is going to reach the PISA age. Now, when it comes to self-regulation, overall, as you can see here, girls demonstrated slightly stronger skills than boys in the direct assessment of self-regulation. You can see the green segments are longer, but again, parent and teacher reports for girls were more positive than for boys. So it's something that, again, the perception among parents and teachers about the girls' advantage was stronger than what we could actually see in the data. And also teachers, as you can see on the lower pane, reported even larger learning and behavioral differences between girls and boys than parents did. Now, these findings are all noteworthy because the study found that boys were as likely to have attended early childhood education as girls, so no gender differences in participation. And parents, on the whole, also do the same kind of things with their sons as with their daughter. Now, at least on this questionnaire, they reported similar frequency in those activities. Differences in children's skills were also found in relation to the child's socioeconomic background. And that's quite consistent with what we see from other studies. Children from high social backgrounds had higher levels of skills than children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And that's across almost all of the learning domains in the study. Some more, some less, as you can see on the screen here. The relationship between social background was most pronounced for the cognitive measures in the study, especially numeracy, but it was still evident in the social emotional dimensions. The area where children from advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds were most closely matched was in disruptive behavior, at least what teachers told us. In fact, there were no reported differences between those two groups of children in Estonia and the United States, but there was a difference based on social status in England. To give you a sense what the score points that you see on the screen actually mean, the score point difference between the youngest children in the study who have just turned 5 and those who are exactly 6 years old is approximately 70 score points. So it's a little higher in numeracy and a bit lower in some of the social emotional dimensions, but it's an indication of the size of the learning progression that you'd expect over a year for this group. It's not precise because these are not kind of true longitudinal. It could be a selection effect, but it gives you sort of a rough indication. In other words, privileged children are at 5 years of age roughly 1 year ahead of disadvantaged children in cognitive domains and about half a year ahead in the social and emotional domains. That's quite a big gap at the very early start, because we know from most of our studies what happens afterwards tends to reinforce, not moderate, social disparities. When you look at this by country, Estonia had the smallest difference among children based on their social background, whereas the greatest difference found in the United States. You could see actually the influence that social background has on learning outcomes was actually quite different across the systems. One factor that is often included in studies of this nature is mother's education. It's often part of socioeconomic status, but we looked at whether there was any association between mother's education, a separate variable, and children's learning across the 10 dimensions in the study. And what we saw is that the strongest relationship between mother's education and children's learning was in relation to the cognitive dimension, literacy and numeracy. We also included questions on father's education, of course, but unfortunately not enough fathers responded to this question to enable us to look at the relationship between fathers' education levels and their children's early learning. Now, background is important, but we could also see, and that's where this story gets a lot more interesting, that children from low social groups did better across most of the learning dimensions when their parents, as you can see here, read to them regularly, had many books in the home, children, had back and forth conversations with children, and looked, and it took them to special activities such as dance, swimming, or scouts. And also, importantly, they did better when they were involved in early childhood education and care, or schools, which they attended. So actually what we do with children is as important as where they come from. One of the most troubling findings of the study was that disadvantaged children are actually less likely to attend early childhood education than children from wealthier families. Now, those children who need it most get the least opportunity to take part in early childhood learning. And it's troubling because, that's where we could make such a difference. Children from wealthy backgrounds are going to have many open doors in life. They are going to sort of see many opportunities. But children from disadvantaged backgrounds really only have one single chance in life, and that is a good teacher and a good early childhood education and care and a good school. They miss that boat, they're rarely going to have a second chance because, as I said before, most of what's happening afterwards tends to reinforce the differences that we see early on. While, financial constraints in disadvantaged families will often prevent them from, doing things like buying books for their children or taking them to paid activities, there are some education systems that are now trying to offset those disadvantages through initiatives such as mobile libraries, books in home programs, and also community-based sporting and cultural activities. So that's the good news that we're seeing some countries sort of taking initiative on this. Having a home language that is different from the assessment language was also negatively associated with emergent literacy, no surprise, but it's also clearly visible in numeracy and self-regulation scores. In all participating countries, you can see that effect. Teachers also said that these children have lower levels of pro-social behavior and trust than other children. But at the same time, those children were less disruptive than other children. Also, children that were reported by their parents as having learning difficulties, such as speech or language delays, or to have social and emotional or behavioral difficulties, had lower levels of skills across almost every measure that we studied here. The United States had more children with learning challenges than other countries. But overall, you can see 13% of children across these three countries had a different home language from that of their school or early childhood education care center. Now, 20% of children in the US, 16% in England, and 6% in Estonia. Variability, but you can see in every country, it's a significant minority. As you can see also, on average across countries, 11% of children had experienced learning difficulties and 10% had social, emotional, or behavioral difficulties, according to parents. More children were reported by their parents as having at least one of those difficulties in the US than in England or Estonia. Interestingly also, boys were twice as likely as girls to be reported by their parents as having learning difficulties such as speech or language delays, or to have social and emotional behavioral difficulties. And that was especially the case for boys from disadvantaged backgrounds. Interestingly, the study did not find significant differences, at least at aggregate levels, in the development and learning of children with a migrant background compared to other children. No. At least one socioeconomic background and home language was accounted for. So the immigration effect is not something that we could see among 5-year-olds. But the immigrant children were reported by teachers as having lower levels of pro-social behavior and also trust than other children, but also as being less disruptive than other children. So the picture is quite similar to children whose home language is different from early childhood education and care center language. And often, of course, those two factors are interrelated. As I said earlier, what parents do with their children matters a great deal for children's learning and well-being, regardless of social background. For example, reading with children was strongly correlated with children's emergent literacy and their social emotional skills. Children whose parents read to them 5 to 7 times a week had higher scores than children whose parents read to them 3 to 4 times a week, and which was still associated with stronger skill development than reading to children once a week or not at all. So again, this doesn't take a degree. It is not, taking a lot of time. It's an activity that is clearly visible in the achievement of children. At the same time, the study found that moderate engagement in some activities was more strongly associated with children's learning than daily frequency. To give you an example, children who attended special activities 3 or 4 times a week had higher scores, such as in self-regulation, than children who attended such activity every day. There seems some curvilinear relationship where moderate frequency seems to be the optimum. And here you can see that having a high number of children's books in the home, over 100, is strongly correlated with children's cognitive development. But also their positive relationships with children's social and emotional well-being. Parents' involvement in their child's early childhood education in care center or school is also positively associated with children's cognitive development, but more so with children's prosocial skills and trust. Almost all children in England as in Estonia attend some form of early childhood education in care settings by the age of 3. In the US, 52% of children in the study had attended early childhood education in care by the age of 3 or younger, although children from advantaged families had higher participation rates. So once again, there was a kind of regressive allocation of resources to children by social background. Children in the US who had attended early childhood education and care also demonstrated higher emergent literacy skills and much higher emergent numeracy skills than children who had never attended early childhood education and care. You can see the red bar for numeracy particularly long, and again, regardless of their social background. But attending early childhood education and care was not significantly associated with children's self-regulation or social emotional skills, neither positively or negatively. We also found no discernible benefits from starting early childhood education and care before the age of 3 on the outcomes that we have measured here. Technology. Most of the 5-year-olds in this study, 83%, used a digital device at least once a week, and 42% did so on a daily basis. Children in the US were the most likely to use a digital device regularly, whereas children in Estonia were the least likely. Again, you can see interesting country differences on this. Now, what we saw is that there was no clear relationship between the regular use of electronic devices and children's development and skills. But there was a positive relationship between the frequency of device use and the mental flexibility skills of children in Estonia and the US, although we didn't see that in England. There are also some associations between device use and emergent literacy in England and the US. We didn't see that in Estonia. So what you can see is that some of those findings are still sort of quite patchy and the relationships are not clear. What matters for children is going to depend on what they are using the devices for and how long they are using them, and whether device use is complementary to other activities or displaces them. A lot more research will be needed on that question. There were positive relationships between each of the 10 dimensions of children's early development and learning in the study. They were independent in one way in predicting outcomes. You could also see that there were some intercorrelations between them. For example, as you can see here, emergent literacy and emergent numeracy were strongly correlated. So children that were good in reading also were stronger on the numeracy side, and these also correlated positively with self-regulation skills, particularly mental flexibility and working memory. At the same time, there were positive associations between the cognitive aspects of the study, again, emergent literacy, numeracy, self-regulation, and children's social and emotional skills, particularly with empathy and prosocial behavior. Thus, children learning gains in any one area support can support development in other areas of their developments. Again, it highlights why a holistic approach is so important. Now, 5-year-olds in Estonia were more able to recognize the emotions of others, which is a precursor for empathy. And they also were reported by their teachers as having higher prosocial skills than children in England or the United States. Levels of trust, you can see, were quite similar across the 3 countries. You can see the symbols very close to each other. Teachers in England and the US reported 5-year-olds as less disruptive than were reported by teachers in Estonia. Now, on the right side of the chart, you can see the biggest kind of differences. And last but not least, let's compare the cognitive results. England and Estonia had similar results for emergent literacy, working memory, and mental flexibility. Children in England were demonstrating stronger numeracy skills than children in either Estonia or the United States. Now that's where you can see sort of a big kind of variation across countries. Children in the US were found to have similar levels in inhibiting impulses than children in Estonia, which were higher than in England. Emergent literacy and emergent numeracy skills of children in the US, however, were significantly lower than for children in Estonia and England. And that gap was particularly pronounced in emergent numeracy, consistent with the relatively lower levels of math competencies that we then see among 15-year-olds in PISA in the US. So interesting kind of cognitive differences as well, and we need a lot more further research to understand where they come from and what we can do about it. There are a lot of things that we can learn from this study, but let me just highlight a couple of points. First, differences based on socioeconomic status were significant at age 5 across all learning areas in the study. And that's a major finding for countries in terms of the implications for really mitigating disadvantage. Gender differences were not as great as socioeconomic differences. Girls did better than boys in emergent literacy and all 5 measures of social emotional development in all 3 countries. What the study shows us is that attending early childhood education and care and also parental activities with their children is associated very clearly with stronger child development. And again, that works across all social strata. So a lot can be done to mitigate disadvantage and ensure every child has a positive outlook ahead. Most 5-year-olds in the study use digital devices quite regularly. Again, that was not strongly associated with their learning or development. While there were some positive associations, they varied across countries, so I don't think we should draw firm conclusions at this stage. But device use, depending on the context and also its intensity, does not appear to be associated with poorer learning outcomes or lower levels of well-being. That's also important. Children's social emotional skills and cognitive development is interrelated. So each type of skill supports the development of other skills. Parents, of course, know this, and teachers do so as well. So I hope that is going to help education leaders and policymakers to better understand how those different types of skill can support children to develop, learn, and to show positive well-being. In a nutshell, this study shows clearly that if we want to mitigate disadvantage, we cannot wait until children arrive at school. For some children, that's going to be too late. For others, early schooling may be able to help them catch up, but it will depend on the quality and responsiveness of those critical first years in school. And that's going to be very risky if we rely all to sort of on the first year of schooling to fix everything. And obviously, it won't work for a number of children. Clearly, policymakers need information on the effects of early childhood education and care provision. Surprising that it's the very first time that this has been studied. Early childhood education and care has been around. A lot of children go there. But while we have so many devices in school to understand the quality of learning outcomes, variability in provision, and so on, in early childhood education, we're just scratching the surface here. Without really good information, it's going to be hard to gauge whether early childhood education and care is having a positive effect on children or not, or what type of provision will benefit them most. And having cross-country comparable data is going to help a lot of countries who are serious about giving children a strong start. And the other implication is that education systems will need to think laterally about how to reach parents and communities so that the kinds of learning opportunities I talked about today are actually available to all children, not just those from privileged backgrounds. Now, those were some initial findings. The reports from the study are available on our website. You'll also find country reports for England, Estonia, and the United States, in addition to a comparative report. So we basically analyzed the results of this study in the specific context of each of the countries, and the reports are really, really interesting. We also have a short brochure on the key findings, and very soon, a recording of this presentation. Now we have time for some questions. And I have with me my colleague Rowena Fair, who's actually been the mastermind of this study, who led the development, the implementation, and analysis of all of this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your very interesting presentation. So, as you say, Rowena Fair is with us here, so I'd like to get some questions answered. You mentioned earlier in your presentation about teachers and their participation. So maybe we can have a bit more about what teachers thought of the study.
Well, I'll let Rowena speak to this, but this was one of the most encouraging insights for us, that how enthusiastic teachers in all of the three countries joined us in the development of the study, but then also in completing the questionnaires for this. Now, we have usually struggled to get teachers responding to surveys, including, our assessments like PISA or even TALIS. But when we spoke with the teachers in early childhood education and care, they were really enthusiastic that their voice was heard, that there was a study that would actually support them in improving the quality of early childhood education and provision. So the participation rates were amazing, but I'll let Rowena speak to this in more detail.
Thanks, Andreas. Yes, the teacher response rates in each country were at 90% or higher. In fact, in the United States, 96% of the teachers that were asked to respond fully completed the questionnaires. So what this means for us is first of all, that we can have huge amounts of confidence in this data. So these high response rates means that the data is very, very robust. But I think more importantly than that, the teachers are telling us something. What they're telling us is that they think that policymakers and education leaders having more information on children at this age is important. As part of the implementing the study, the Secretariat visited each of the participating countries, and we met with teachers, we met with heads, we met with some parents, we met with, we actually watched some of the assessments, children doing assessments, and we asked the teachers and the ECEC centres and schools why they were happy to participate. And what they said to us is that they think this age group has been neglected in terms of, and from an international perspective, they thought that more information needed to be available on how 5-year-olds, how this age group is faring. They want policymakers and education leaders to have that more information. They want a spotlight on this age group, and they think that an international study of this nature is going to achieve that. They also said to us they really liked the design of the study. They liked the balanced approach across social emotional skills and cognitive development. And one school that I went to, they said that they liked the questionnaire so much they had adopted it as the means to assess all of their children.
Thank you, Rowena. On our next question, what about the actual children who took part in the study? Can we learn a bit more about that?
Well, I can talk about the children's experiences of the assessment. So the assessment was developed for 5-year-olds. So there was a lot of effort and thought that went into how to make this a positive experience for children so that the process was both enjoyable and of course it was going to obtain the information that we needed, but that the children enjoyed that process. So the activities were, as Andreas said, they were on a tablet. The children very much enjoyed engaging with the tablet. There were stories, activities. They were all developmentally appropriate. They'd been trialled with many different groups of children, and in the main, the children found them very, very engaging. They enjoyed. There were jokes in the stories. When I was watching assessment, I saw children. The things that the stories were engaging, and so it was a positive experience for children. We had trained study administrators who supported each child one-on-one. It was so important that each child had a good experience through that assessment. Yes, it makes it a little bit more costly, but it means that each child, that whole experience is going to be a positive one for each child. The children completed the activities. It was around 15 minutes. So 15 minutes for one activity, then they could take a break. 15 minutes, and then that was it for that day. Also, and 2 more activities the following day, and we had pretty much no attrition between day 1 and day 2. So these are 5-year-olds. We're not, they were only doing the activities if they were happy to do it, and they were happy to come back on day 2 and to re-engage with the characters, Tom and Mia, the cartoon characters that Andreas showed, and and so it was. The children were very happy with the process.
Yeah. If I may add to this, I think this process has also taught us a lot. This process has also taught us a lot about how to conduct assessments. Often, we do assessments in a rather contrived environment. We teach young people something, and then we put them in a separate situation where they take a test. In this case, we basically integrated the assessment into the activities of children. So they naturally played with the computer, and what the computer did was observing how they played and what they did. So the assessment was really integrated into the play and learning of the children, rather than coming out on top or being sort of a sort of artificial observation of their activities. And I do think this is where the future of assessment really lies, to integrate the world of learning and the world of assessment, rather than separating them artificially. So I think it's a great example to do that. And as you can see in the reaction of children, that they are, just enthusiastic about it.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Andreas. Yes, it is an interesting aspect of the study. Maybe you can also, we can go into now, we talked about the technology and the use of tablets. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that.
Perhaps if I pick up here. In PISA 2018, we asked
15-year-olds whether they have access to the internet before they were 6 years old, and in 2018 20% of the students in the PISA study told us that they did have access to the internet. Now what you can see in this study is that amongst the 5-year-olds, 93% of them had access at least monthly, if not weekly or daily. So only 7% don't have access to digital devices. So that's a huge shift over a 10-year period. So what we can say is that in these 3 countries at least, digital devices are part of children's everyday life, and it's at very high numbers. So it's not something that's particular to a small group of children. Now, as Andreas said, this is the very first time we've been able to compare the use of digital devices in 5-year-olds' cognitive and social emotional development. And what we can see that the results are a little bit patchy. Certainly there are no large alarm bells. I don't think people should be concerned. There are some positive associations. But of course, as Andreas said, it's going to depend on what children are doing, how long they're on the device for, and whether it's displacing any other activities that you would expect 5-year-olds to do. But what we can also see is that the use of a device in no way is as significant as children spending time with their families, with reading books to them, playing with other children through special activities, those and going to early childhood education and care. Those activities matter, and they're much more consistent across the countries, and much clearer pattern.
Thank you, Rowena. Maybe for our last question, could you let us know, either Andreas and Marina, what the big takeout for you from the study is?
Well, for me, the social disparities that we see early on, I think, are a deep concern because, again, that is the starting point with which children start their lives. And what happens afterwards is going to reinforce those kinds of differences. I think that's something that policymakers need to work on. We have very patchy early childhood provision. Again, school is a quite predictable experience, quite well organized. There's a clear curricula. Society spends a lot of time and energy to ensure that we sort of provide children with consistent service. We pay for that publicly. And again, none of this is visible in early childhood education. Again, a country like Estonia more than in the United States, but even in Estonia, it's a lot of variability. And I do believe it's important that public policy takes this to heart. We now have data on the outcomes and ensures that every child has access to excellent teaching in those very early years. That's the biggest takeaway. Gender difference is also very interesting, that we actually can see very early on in lives of children important differences. And in some cases, one of the things that I found really noteworthy is that those differences are often larger when we survey parents and teachers than what we actually observe in the children. So maybe there are some biases that we as educators have when, judging and looking at the work of children. So having direct information available, what children can do, will help us overcome and see some of those distortions. I see that is very important. But the visibility of many things that we then see magnified later in school so early on suggests that we really need to redouble our efforts to give every child a strong start.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and also to Marina for your your responses and your presentation. And thank you to our audience for listening. Just to remind you that the audio and the presentation of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/user/educontact. So once again, thank you for everybody for participating.